Others, smaller and weaker than he, have made attempts on the life of men great and courageous as you, if ever there have been such. Give me your consent, and this very night I will go and capture Angelus and tear out his eyes with my own hands, then I will hang him from a column of his palace. The people will be told that you received a message from heaven. Better to be rid at once of someone who does not yet threaten you, than leave him alive so that he may threaten you one day. Let us strike first. You are trying to use me to satisfy some grudge of your own, the basilisk said, but it may be that in doing evil you may also be favoring good. Get rid of Isaac for me. I only regret. And he gave Zosimos such a look that he shivered with fear, for, with Isaac dead, we will never know if he really wanted to harm me, or if this monk has told the truth. But in the end he has aroused in me a just suspicion, and if you think the worst, you are always right. Stephen, we are obliged to show him our gratitude. See that he has what he may ask. He made a gesture to the two attendants and went out, leaving Zosimos to recover slowly from the terror that had petrified him beside his basin. In fact, Agia Christophorites did hate Isaac Angelus, and obviously had arranged with Zosimos to make him fall out of favor, Nikitas said. But serving his own rancor did not do his master good, because as you must know, he hastened the basilisk's ruin. I know, Buandulino said, but actually, on that evening it mattered little to me that I understand what was going on. It was enough for me to know that now I had Zosimos in my grasp. As soon as the sound of the royal visitor's footsteps had died away, Zosimos heaved a great sigh. The experiment, after all, had succeeded. He rubbed his hands, with a little smile of satisfaction, drew the boy's head from the water and laid it where it had been before. Then he turned, to examine the crypt, and began laughing hysterically, raising his arms and shouting. I have the basilisk in my power. Now I won't be afraid even of the dead. No sooner had he spoken than our friends slowly came out into the light. Those who perform magic, it so happens, finally are persuaded that, even if they don't believe in the devil surely believes in them. Seeing a band of lemurs arising as if it were Judgment Day, Zosimos, scoundrel though he was, at that moment behaved with exemplary spontaneity. Without trying to conceal his feelings, he fainted. He came to as the poet was sprinkling him with some divinatory water. He opened his eyes and found himself confronted by a buandulino fearsome to see, more than if he were returning from the other world. At that moment Zosimos realized that, worse than the flames of an uncertain hell, the certain vengeance of his former victim awaited him. I did it to serve my master, he hastened to say, and to do you, too, a service. I've spread your letter more than you could ever have. Buandulino said, Zosimos, I don't want to sound mean, but if I were to obey the inspiration I received from our Lord, I would smash your ass. But since that would be hard work, as you see, I am restraining myself. And he gave him a slap with the back of his hand that made his head spin around twice. I am a man of the basilisk. If you touch a single hair of my beard, I swear. The poet seized him by the hair, pulled his face to the flames that were still flickering around the basin, and Zosimos's beard began to smoke. You are all mad, Zosimos said, trying to elude the grip of Abdul and Kayat, who had grabbed him and were twisting his arms behind his back. And Buandulino, with a slap on the nape, pushed him headlong, to extinguish the beard's fire in the basin, preventing him from raising his head until the wretch, no longer fearing the fire, began to fear the water, and the more he feared it, the more he swallowed. From the bubbles you've made, Buandulino said serenely, pulling him up by the hair, I can predict that tonight you will die not with your beard but with your feet toasted. Buandulino, Zosimos sobbed, vomiting water, Buandulino, we can still come to some agreement. Let me cough, I beg you. I can't escape. What are you going to do, all of you against one lone man? Have you no pity? Listen, Buandulino, I know you don't want to take revenge for that moment of weakness on my part. You want to reach the land of that Prester John of yours, and I told you I have the very map to get you there. If you throw dust on the fire of the hearth it will go out. What does that mean, you bandit? Enough of your pronouncements. It means that if you kill me, you'll never see the map. Often fish, playing in the water, leap out beyond the confines of their natural dwelling. I can enable you to go far. Let us make a pact, like two honest men. You let me go, and I will lead you to the place where the map of Cosmos the Indicaplustes is. My life for the kingdom of Prester John. Doesn't that seem a fair bargain to you? I'd rather kill you, Buandulino said, but I need you alive to get the map. And afterwards? Afterwards we'll keep you well tied up and wrapped in a carpet until we find a reliable ship that will take us far from here, and only then will we unroll the carpet, because if we let you go at once you will immediately have every killer in the city on our heels. And you'll unroll it in the water. Enough. We're not murderers. If I wanted to kill you later, I wouldn't be slapping you now. And, you see, I do it for a good reason, personal satisfaction, since I don't plan to do anything worse. And he began calmly dealing out blows, first with one hand, then with the other, one blow swinging the head to the left, another swinging it to the right, twice with the palm hard, twice with tensed fingers, twice with the back of the hand, twice with the edge, twice with the fists, until Zosimos became purplish and Buandulino had almost dislocated his wrists. Now it's beginning to hurt me, he said, and I'll stop. Let's go see this map. Kayat and Abdul dragged Zosimos by the armpits, for by now he could no longer stand on his own feet, and could barely point out the way with a trembling finger, as he murmured. The monk who is despised and bears it is like a plant that is watered every day. Buandulino said to the poet, Zosimos once taught me that anger more than any other passion upsets and troubles the soul, but sometimes helps it. When in fact we use it calmly against the wicked and sinners to save them or confound them, we give the soul sweetness, because we are proceeding directly towards the ends of justice. Rabbi Solomon commented, as the Talmud says, there are punishments that cleanse all the iniquities of a man. 21. Buandulino and the Sweets of Byzantium. The monastery of Catabates was in ruins, and everyone now considered it uninhabited, but at ground level some cells still existed, and the old library, now without books, had become a kind of refectory. Here Zosimos lived with 2 or 3 acolytes, and only God knew what their monastic rites were. When Buandulino and the others emerged from underground with their prisoner, the acolytes were sleeping, but, as was clear the following morning, they were sufficiently stupefied by their excesses that they did not represent a danger. The group decided it was best to sleep in the library. Zosimos had troubled dreams as he lay on the ground between Kayat and Abdul, who had now become his guardian angels. In the morning all sat around a table, and Zosimos was invited to come to the point. The point is, Zosimos said, that the map of Cosmos is in the Bucolion Palace, in a place known to me and where only I have access. We will go there late this evening. Zosimos, Buandulino said, you are beating about the bush. First of all, explain to me clearly what this map says. Why, it's quite simple, isn't it? Zosimos said, taking a parchment and a stylus. I told you that every Christian who follows the true faith must agree to the fact that the world is made like the tabernacle of which the scriptures speak. Now listen carefully to what I say. In the lower part of the tabernacle there was a table with 12 loaves of bread and 12 fruits, one for each month of the year. All around the table ran a plinth that depicted the ocean, and around the plinth there was a frame 1 palm wide that depicted the land of the beyond, where to the east the earthly paradise is situated. The sky was represented by the vault, which rested entirely on the extremities of the earth, but between the vault and the base extended the veil of the firmament, beyond which lies the celestial world that only one day will we see face to face. In fact, as Isaiah said, God is he who is seated above the earth, whose inhabitants are as locusts. He who like a thin veil has unfurled the sky and spread it out like a tent. And the psalmist praises him who spreads out the sky like a pavilion. Then Moses placed, below the veil, south of the candelabrum that illuminated all the expanse of the earth, 7 lamps to signify the 7 days of the week and all the stars of the sky. But you were explaining to me how the tabernacle was made, Buandulino said, not how the universe is made. But the universe is made like the tabernacle, and so if I explain to you what the tabernacle was like, I am explaining what the universe is like. Why can't you understand something so simple? Look. And he made a drawing. It showed the form of the universe, exactly like a temple, with its curving vault, whose upper part remained concealed from our eyes by the veil of the firmament. Below the acumen extends, that is, all the inhabited earth, which, however, is not flat, but rests on the ocean, which surrounds it, and rises through an imperceptible and continuous slope towards the extreme north and towards the west, where a mountain stands, so high that its presence escapes our eye and its peak is lost in the clouds. The sun and the moon, moved by the angels, to whom we owe also rain, earthquake, and all other atmospheric phenomena, pass in the morning from east towards the south, in front of the mountain, and illuminate the world, and in the evening they reascend towards the west and disappear behind the mountain, giving us the impression of sunset. And so, while for us night is falling, on the other side of the mountain it is day, but that day is seen by no one, because the mountain on the other side is desert, and no one has ever been there. And with this drawing we're supposed to find the land of Prester John? Buandulino asked. See here, Zosimos, our agreement was your life for a good map, but if the map is no good, then the conditions change. Calm down. Considering that, to depict the tabernacle as it is, our art is incapable of showing everything that remains covered by its walls and by the mountain, Cosmos drew another map, which shows the earth as if we were looking down on it from above, flying in the firmament, as the angels see it. This map, which is kept in the Bucolion, shows the position of the lands that we know, included within the frame of the ocean, and beyond the ocean, the lands inhabited by man before the flood, where, after Noah, no one has ever set foot. Once again, Zosimos, Buandulino said, putting on a ferocious face, if you think that by talking to us of things you won't let us see. But I see these things, as if they were here before my eyes, and soon you will also see them. With that haggard face, made all the more pathetic by the bruises, his eyes shining with things that only he could discern, Zosimos was convincing even to those who distrusted him. It was his strength, Buandulino explained to Nikitas, and in this way he had hoodwinked him before, and was hoodwinking him now and would continue to do so for several more years. He was so convincing that he wanted even to clarify how it was possible, with the tabernacle of Cosmos, to explain eclipses also, but eclipses didn't interest Buandulino. What convinced him was that with the true map perhaps they could really set out in search of the priest. Very well, he said, we'll wait till this evening. Zosimos had one of his monks serve some cooked greens and fruit, and when the poet asked if there was nothing else, he answered, frugal food, uniformly regulated, will quickly lead the monk to the harbor of his invulnerability. The poet told him to go to the devil, then seeing that Zosimos ate with great gusto, he looked more closely into the dish of greens and discovered that the acolytes had concealed there, just for Zosimos, some nice chunks of fat lamb. Without a word, he exchanged plates. So they were prepared to spend the day waiting when one of the acolytes entered with a stunned expression and reported what was happening. In the night, immediately after the ritual, Stephen Agiochristophoриtes, with a squad of armed men, went to the house of Isaac Angelus, near the Pribleptos monastery, the shrine of the famous Virgin, and called for his enemy in a loud voice to come forth. Or, rather, he shouted to his own men to break down the door, seize Isaac by the beard, and carry him out head down. Isaac then, though according to report he was hesitant and fearful, decided to risk all or nothing. He seized a horse in the courtyard and, sword drawn, scantily clad, a bit ridiculous with his two-colored cloak that barely reached his loins, suddenly rode out, catching his enemy by surprise. The Agiochristophoриtes didn't have time to draw his own weapon when Isaac, with a single blow of his sword, split his enemy's head in two. Then he turned to the now bicephalic Stephen's henchmen, slicing the ear off one of them, as the others ran away in fear. Killing the emperor's trusted aide was an extreme act, and demanded an extreme remedy. Isaac, revealing a great sense of how the populace should be dealt with, dashed to St. Sophia, demanding the asylum that tradition granted homicides, and loudly implored forgiveness for his own misdeed. He tore off what little clothing he had on as well as the hairs of his beard. He displayed his still bloody sword, and, while he was asking for mercy, suggested he had acted in self-defense, reminding all of the crimes of the slain man. "I don't like this story," Zosimos said, distraught because of the sudden death of his grim, dire protector. Less likable still would be the news that arrived subsequently, hour by hour. Isaac had been overtaken at St. Sophia by illustrious figures including Johannes Doukas. Isaac continued to harangue the constantly swelling crowd. Towards evening a great number of citizens had gathered around Isaac in the church to protect him, though some were beginning to murmur that it was time to put an end to the tyrant. Whether Isaac, as Zosimos' necromancy asserted, had long been preparing his coup, or whether he happily exploited a misstep by his enemies, it was clear that the throne of Andronicus was now tottering. It was equally clear that, in this situation, it would be madness to enter the royal palace, which could at any moment become a public shambles. All agreed that it was necessary to await the outcome of events at Catabates. The next morning half the citizenry was out in the streets calling in loud voices for the imprisonment of Andronicus and the raising of Isaac to the imperial throne. The populace attacked the public prisons, liberating many innocent victims of the tyrant, men of illustrious name who immediately joined in the uprising. But by now it was not so much an uprising as a revolt, a revolution, a seizure of power. The citizens, in arms, ranged through the streets, some with sword and buckler, some with clubs or sticks. Some of them, including many imperial dignitaries, who had concluded that this was perhaps the right time to choose a new autocrat, lowered the crown of Constantine the Great, which hung over the main altar of the church, and crowned Isaac. Swarming from the church in fighting mood, the crowd lay siege to the imperial palace. Andronicus put up a desperate resistance, firing arrows from the top of the highest tower, the so-called Centenarian. But he had to give in to the now imperious fury of his subjects. It was said that he tore the crucifix from his chest, took off his purple sandals, stuck a pointed barbarian-style cap on his head, and proceeded, through the labyrinths of the Bucolion to board his ship, taking with him his wife and the prostitute Maraptica, with whom he was madly in love. Isaac triumphantly entered the palace. The crowd overran the city, attacked the minter, as it was called, the golden lavabos, entered the armories, and turned to sacking the palace churches, tearing ornaments from the holy images. Now Zosimos, at every new rumor, trembled more and more, since it was already being said that, once an accomplice of Andronicus was identified, he was put to the sword. On the other hand, Buandulino and his friends also considered it unwise to venture at this time into the corridors of the Bucolion. And so, unable to do anything but eat and drink, our friends spent a few more days at Catabates. Until it was learned that Isaac had moved from the Bucolion to the Blacherne Palace, at the far northern tip of the city. This perhaps made the Bucolion less protected and, since there was nothing left to sack, fairly deserted. On that same day, Andronicus was captured on the shore of the Euxine and was brought before Isaac. The courtiers had kicked and beaten him, torn out his beard, knocked out his teeth, shaved his head. Now they cut off his right hand and flung him into prison. When news arrived that in the city joyful dancing and festivities had sprung up at every corner, Buandulino decided that in the confusion they could head for the Bucolion. Zosimos pointed out that he might be recognized, and the friends told him not to worry. Arming themselves with every instrument they had at their disposal, they shaved his head and beard, while he wept, considering himself dishonored by the loss of those insignia of monastic venerability. In fact, hairless as an egg, Zosimos appeared totally without chin, his upper lip protruding, his ears pointed like a dog's, and, Buandulino observed, he looked more like Sicinicio, an idiot who roamed the streets of Alessandria shouting obscenities at the girls, than like the accursed ascetic he had so far passed himself off as. To adjust this deplorable effect, they sprinkled him with cosmetics, and at the end he seemed a freak, a character that in Lombardy children would have followed with taunts and a shower of rotten fruit, but in Constantinople it was an everyday sight, Buandulino said, like going around Alessandria dressed as a vendor of Sarasso, or ricotta as it is also called. They crossed the city and witnessed the passage of Andronicus, more mangy looking than the mangy camel on which he had been hoisted. He was almost naked, with a foul clump of bloody rags on the stump of his right wrist, and clotted blood on his gaunt cheeks, because they had just gouged out one of his eyes. Around him the most desperate of the city's inhabitants, whose lord and autocrat he had been for so long, sausage-makers, tanners, and the dregs of every tavern, collecting like swarms of flies in spring around a horse turd, struck his head with their clubs, stuffed ox excrement in his nostrils, squeezed sponges soaked in cow piss over his nose, thrust skewers into his legs. The milder threw stones at him, calling him rabid dog and son of a bitch in heat. From a brothel window, a prostitute emptied a pan of boiling water over him. Then the crowd's fury increased further. They pulled him down from the camel and hanged him by his feet from the two columns beside the statue of the she-wolf giving suck to Romulus and Remus. Andronicus behaved better than his tormentors, not emitting a moan. He confined himself to murmuring, Kyrie eleison, and asked why they were breaking a chain already shattered. Once he was strung up, a man with a sword neatly cut off his genitals, another stuck a spear in his mouth, impaling him to his viscera, while still another impaled him through the anus. There were also some Latins present, who had scimitars and moved as if they were dancing around him, slashing away all his flesh, and perhaps they were the only ones entitled to vengeance, given what Andronicus had done to those of their race a few years before. Finally the wretch still had the strength to raise to his mouth his right stump, as if he wanted to drink his blood, to make up for the blood that he was losing in great spurts. Then he died. Having fled that spectacle, our friends tried to reach the Bucolion, but when they were near, they quickly realized that it was impossible to gain entry. Isaac, disgusted by all the looting, had now set his guards to protect it, and anyone attempting to pass that defense was executed on the spot. You can get by in any case, Zosimos, Buandulino said. It's simple. You enter, get the map, and bring it to us. What if they cut my throat? If you don't go, then we'll cut it. My sacrifice would make sense if the map were in the palace. But, to tell you the truth, the map isn't there. Buandulino looked at him as if unable to comprehend such shameless behavior. Ah, he roared, and now at last you're telling the truth? Why have you continued to lie until now? I was trying to gain time. Gaining time isn't a sin. For a monk, wasting time is a sin. We'll kill him here on the spot, the poet said. This is the right moment. In this massacre nobody will notice. Let's decide who strangles him, and it's over. One moment, Zosimos said. The Lord teaches us how to abstain from the deed that is not profitable. I lied, true, but for good reason. What good? Buandulino said, exasperated. My own, Zosimos answered. I had every right to protect my life, since you meant to take it from me. Monks, like cherubim and seraphim, must be all covered with eyes, or, this is how I interpret the saying of so many of the desert fathers, they must exercise wit and cleverness in the face of the enemy. But the enemy those fathers of yours were talking about was the devil, not us. Buandulino cried. The stratagems of devils are different. They appear in dreams, they create hallucinations, they conspire to deceive us, they transform themselves into angels of light and they spare us to make us feel a false security. What would you have done in my place? And what will you do now, you filthy Greekling, to save your life once again? I will tell you the truth, as is my habit. Cosmos's map does really exist, and I have seen it with these eyes. Where it is now, I don't know, but I swear that I have it in my head as if it were printed there. And he tapped his brow, now free of hair. I could tell you, day by day, the distances that separate us from the land of Prester John. Now, obviously, I cannot remain in this city, and you have no reason to stay here either, since you came for me and now you have me, and for the map, which you don't have. If you kill me, you'll have nothing. If you take me with you, I swear by all the holy apostles that I will be your slave and I will devote my days to tracing for you an itinerary that will lead you straight to the land of the priest. Sparing my life costs you nothing, except a mouth to feed. Killing me, you lose everything. Yes, or no? This is the most shameless of all the shameless creatures I've met in my life, Boron said, and the others agreed. Zosimos waited, composed, in silence. Rabbi Solomon ventured to say, the Holy One, be his name always blessed. But Buandulino wouldn't let him finish. No more proverbs. This rogue says enough of them. He's a rogue, but he's right. We have to take him along. Otherwise Frederick will see us return empty-handed and will think we've spent his money wallowing in oriental orgies. We'll at least return with a prisoner. But you, Zosimos, swear that you won't try some other trick on us. I swear by all 12 of the holy apostles, Zosimos said. 11, you wretch, Buandulino shouted at him, seizing his clothes. If you say 12, you're including Judas. All right then, 11. And so, Nikitas said, this was your first journey to Byzantium. I wouldn't be surprised, after what you saw, if you considered what's happening now at purification. You see, Master Nikitas, Buandulino said, purification, as you call it, has never appealed to me. Alessandria may be a miserable town, but where I come from, when someone in command arouses our dislike, we say goodbye to him and choose a new consul. And even Frederick, choleric as he may have been, when his cousins bothered him, he didn't castrate them, he gave them another duchy. But this isn't the story. I was a lady at the extreme confines of Christendom. I could have continued towards the east, or to the south, and I would have found the Indias. But by then we had spent all our money, and to be able to go to the Orient, I had to return to the Occident. By then I was 43. I have been on the trail of Prester John since I was 16, or even younger, and once again I was forced to postpone my journey. 22. Buandulino loses his father and finds the Grazel. The Genoese sent Boimondo out with Theophilus to make a preliminary inspection of the city, to see if the situation was favorable. It was, more or less, they reported on their return, because a great number of the pilgrims were in the taverns, and the rest seemed to have gathered in St. Sophia, to gaze with greedy eyes on the hoard of relics that had been accumulated there. It was enough to blind you, Boimondo said, but he added that the accumulation of loot had turned into a filthy game. Some pretended to deposit their prey, putting a bit of gim crackery in the pile, while covertly they slipped a saint's bone into their tunic. Since nobody wanted to be caught with a relic on his person, immediately outside the church a kind of market had grown, with still wealthy citizens and Armenian traders. And so, Boimondo snickered, the Greeks who saved a Byzantine coin, shoving it up a hole, have pulled it out to trade for a shin bone of saint. Somebody, which maybe had been in the church next door all along. Maybe they then will sell it back to the church, because the Greeks are smart. It's all a big feeding trough, and then they say we Genoese are the ones who think only of cash. What are they bringing into the church? Nikitas asked. Theophilus gave him a more precise account. He had seen the casket containing the purple cloak of Christ, a piece of reed used in the flagellation, the sponge held up to our Lord on the cross, the crown of thorns, a case containing a piece of the bread consecrated at the Last Supper, the one Jesus offered to Judas. Then a glass box arrived with hairs from the beard of the crucified, torn out by the Jews after the deposition from the cross, and the case was wrapped in the Lord's garments, which the soldiers had gambled over at the foot of the cross. And then the flagellation stake, intact. I also saw them bring in a piece of the Madonna's mantle, Boimondo said. How sad. Nikitas sighed. If you saw only a piece, that means they have already divided it up. It existed whole, in the Blachernay Palace. Long ago 2 men named Galbius and Candidus went on a pilgrimage to Palestine, and in Capernaum they learned that the Virgin's pallium was preserved in the house of a Jew. They made friends with him, spent the night with him, secretly took the measurements of the wooden case that contained the garment. Then in Jerusalem they had an identical case made, went back to Capernaum, switched the cases at night, and brought the cloak to Constantinople, where the church of Saints Peter and Mark was built to house it. Boimondo also reported a rumor that 2 Christian knights had taken, and not yet handed over, 2 heads of St. John the Baptist, one each, and all were wondering which one was the good one. Nikitas smiled, tolerantly. I knew that 2 were being venerated here in the city. The first was brought by Theodosius the Great, and was placed in the church of the precursor. Then Justinian found another at Emmaus. I believe he donated it to some cenobium. People said it had been brought here, but nobody knew any longer where it was. But how is it possible to forget a relic, considering what one is worth? Buandulino asked. The piety of the populace is fickle. For years they are excited by a sacred memento, and then something even more miraculous arrives and they become enthusiastic about that, while the earlier one is forgotten. Which head is the right one? Boimondo asked. Holy things must not be spoken of in human terms. Whichever of the 2 relics was given me, I assure you that in bending to kiss it, I would sense the mystical perfume that it emanates, and I would know it was the true head. At that moment Pevera also arrived from the city. Extraordinary things were happening. To prevent the soldiery, too, from stealing from the heap in St. Sophia, the Doge had ordered a first rapid listing of the things collected, and they had also brought in some Greek monks to identify the various relics. Here it was discovered that, after the majority of the pilgrims had been forced to return what they had taken, now in the church there were not only 2 heads of the Baptist, which they already knew, but 2 sponges for the gall and wormwood and 2 crowns of thorns, not to mention other duplications. A miracle, said Pevera, laughing, with a glance at Buandulino. The most precious among Byzantium's relics had multiplied, like the loaves and fishes. Some of the pilgrims saw the event as a favorable sign from heaven, and they shouted that, if there was such a wealth of these valuable things, the Doge should allow each man to carry home what he had taken. No, it's a miracle favorable to us, Theophilus said, because the Latins will never know which relics are genuine, and they'll be obliged to leave everything here. I'm not so sure, Buandulino said. Each prince or marquis or vassal will be content to take home some holy relic, which will attract crowds of the devout and donations. But then if there's a rumor that another, similar relic exists 1,000 miles away, they'll say that one is fake. Nikitas turned pensive. I don't believe in this miracle. The Lord doesn't confound our minds with the relics of his saints. Buandulino, in these past months, since your arrival in the city, you haven't invented some trick with relics, have you? Master Nikitas, Buandulino tried to say in an offended tone. Then he held his hands out, as if to impose calm on his interlocutor. All right, if I have to tell you everything, the moment will come when I'll have to tell you a story about relics. I'll tell it to you later. Anyway, you yourself said just now that holy things mustn't be spoken of in human terms. But it's late, and I think that in an hour, under cover of darkness, we can set out. We must be ready. Wanting to set out well refreshed, Nikitas had, a while ago, ordered Theophilus to prepare a monocathron, which required some time to be cooked properly. It was a bronze pot full of beef and pork, bones not entirely stripped and Phrygian cabbage, saturated with fat. Since there was little time remaining for a lengthy supper, the logothete had abandoned his good habits and was dipping into the pan not with 3 fingers, but with open hands. It was as if he were consummating his last night of love with the beloved city, virgin, prostitute, and martyr. Bottolino had no appetite and confined himself to sipping the resinous wine, for who knows what he would find in Selembria. Nikitas asked him if Zosimos played a role in this story of relics, and Bottolino said that he preferred to proceed in order. After the horrible things we saw in the city, we returned overland, because there wasn't enough money to pay for the voyage by ship. The confusion of those days allowed Zosimos, with the help of one of those acolytes he was about to abandon, to lay hands on some mules, no telling how. During the journey, after hunting in some forest and with the hospitality of some monasteries along the way, we finally arrived in Venice, and then in the Lombard plain. And Zosimos never tried to escape? He couldn't. From that time on, even after our return, and always at Frederick's court and on the journey to Jerusalem we made later, for more than 4 years he remained in chains. That is, when he was with us, he was free to move, but when we had to leave him alone, he was chained to his bed, to a stake, to a tree, according to where we were, and if we were on horseback, he was tied to the reins in such a way that if he tried to dismount the horse would rear up. Afraid that this would make him forget his obligations, every evening, before he went to sleep, I gave him a slap. By then he knew it was coming and awaited it, like a mother's kiss, before sleeping. During their march the friends had, above all, never ceased prodding Zosimos to reconstruct the map, and he displayed willingness, every day recalling a detail, so that he had already succeeded in calculating the true distances. Roughly, he said, drawing in the dust with one finger, from Zanista, the land of silk, to Persia it is 50 days march, crossing Persia takes 150 days more, from the Persian border to Seleucia 13 days, from Seleucia to Rome and then to the Iberian land, 150 days. More or less, to go from one end of the world to the other, 400 days march, if you do 30 miles a day. Earth, moreover, is more long than wide, and you will recall that in Exodus it is said that in the tabernacle the table must be 2 cubits long and 1 cubit wide. So from north to south you can calculate 50 days from the northern regions to Constantinople, from Constantinople to Alexandria another 50 days, from Alexandria to Ethiopia on the Arabic Gulf, 70 days. In short, more or less 200 days. Therefore, if you set out from Constantinople towards farthest Indias, calculating that you are proceeding obliquely and will have to stop often to find your way, and who knows how many times you will have to turn back, I reckon you would find Prester John after a year's journey. Speaking of relics, Kayat asked Zosimos if he had heard the Grazel spoken of. He had heard it mentioned, to be sure, and by the Galatians, who lived around Constantinople, people who traditionally knew the stories of the very ancient priests of the extreme north. Kayat asked if he had heard of that Pharisee who supposedly took the Grazel to Prester John, and Zosimos said that certainly he had heard of him, but Bottolino remained skeptical. What is this? Grazel then? He asked. The cup in which Christ consecrated the bread and the wine. You've said that yourself. Bread in a cup? No, wine. The bread was on a plate, a patina, a little tray. But what was the Grazel then, the plate or the cup? Both, Zosimos attempted to equivocate. If you thought about it, the poet suggested, with a fearsome expression, it was the spear with which Longinus had pierced the ribs. Yes, of course, that must be it. At this point Bottolino gave him a slap, even if it wasn't yet time to go to bed, but Zosimos defended himself. The stories were vague, yes, but the fact that they circulated also among the Galatians of Byzantium was the proof that this Grazel really existed. And so it went on. Of the Grazel the knowledge was always the same, that there was very little knowledge. Of course, Bottolino said, if we were the ones who bring Frederick the Grazel, and not a gallows bird like you. You can still take it to him, Zosimos suggested. Just find the proper vessel. Ah, so now it's also a vessel? I'll put you in that vessel. I'm not a counterfeiter like you. Zosimos shrugged and stroked his chin, testing the regrowth of his beard, but it was all the uglier now, for he looked like a catfish, whereas, before, the chin had been shiny and smooth like a ball. Furthermore, Bottolino muttered, even if we know it's a chalice or a vase, how can we recognize it when we find it? Oh, you can rest assured. Kayat spoke up, his eyes lost in the world of his legends. You'll see the glow, you'll sense the perfume. Let's hope so, Bottolino said. Rabbi Solomon shook his head. It must be something you Gentiles stole from the temple in Jerusalem when you sacked it and scattered us through the world. They arrived just in time for Henry's wedding. The second son of Frederick, crowned king of the Romans, was to marry Constance of Altavilla. The emperor now placed all his hopes in this junior son. Not that he didn't cherish the older boy. He did. He had even named him king of Swabia, but it was obvious that Frederick loved him with sadness, as happens with children who are born ill. Bottolino saw him, pale, coughing, always blinking his left eyelid as if to chase away a gnat. Even during regal celebrations he often went off by himself, and Bottolino had seen him riding in the countryside, nervously slashing bushes with his crop, as if to calm something that was gnawing him inside. It's an effort for him to live, Frederick said to Bottolino one evening. He himself was aging, old white beard, he moved as if he had a crick in his neck. He wouldn't give up hunting, and as soon as he saw a river, he would throw himself into the water, swimming as of old. But Bottolino was afraid that one of these days, caught in the clutch of cold water, he would have a stroke, and he told him to be careful. To console Frederick, Bottolino told of the success of their mission, how they had captured that faithless monk and soon they would have a map that would lead them to the land of the priest, and how the Grazel was not a fable and one of these days Bottolino would place it in his hands. Frederick nodded. The Grazel, the Grazel, he murmured, his eyes lost in some unknown place. To be sure, with that I could. Then he would be distracted by some important message, sigh again, and with effort prepare to fulfill his duty. Every now and then he would take Buandulino aside and tell him how much he missed Beatrice. To console him, Buandulino would tell how much he missed Calandrina. I know, Frederick would say. You, who loved Calandrina, understand how much I loved Beatrice. But perhaps you don't realize how truly lovable Beatrice was. And, for Buandulino, the wound of his old remorse was reopened. In the summer the emperor returned to Germany, but Buandulino could not follow him. Word came that his mother had died. He rushed to Alessandria, and along the way he kept thinking of that woman who had borne him, and to whom he had never shown any genuine tenderness, except on that Christmas evening so many years before, while the ewe was giving birth. Damn, he said to himself, already more than 15 winters have passed, my God, maybe even 18. He arrived after his mother had been buried, and found that Gagliardo had abandoned the city and gone back to his old house in the marsh. He was lying down, with a wooden bowl full of wine at his side, lazily waving his hand to chase the flies from his face. Buandulino, he said at once, 10 times every day I would be angry with that poor woman, begging heaven to strike her with lightning. And now that heaven has struck her I don't know what to do anymore. In this house I can't find anything, she always put things in order. I can't even find the pitchfork for the muck, and in the stable the stock have more dung than hay. And so, what with one thing and another, I've decided to die, too. Maybe that's best. The son's protests were of no avail. Buandulino, you know that in our parts we have hard heads, and when we get something into our head there's no way to make us change our mind. I'm not a good for nothing like you, here one day and there the next. A fine life you gentlemen have. People who think only about how to kill others, yet one day, if you tell them they have to die, they shit their pants. But I've lived well and never harmed a fly, beside a woman who was a saint, and now that I've decided to die, I'll die. Let me go off like I say, and I'll be satisfied, because the more I stay here the worse it gets. Every now and then he drank a little wine, and fell asleep, then reopened his eyes and asked, Am I dead? No, father, Buandulino answered him, luckily you're still alive. Oh, poor me, he said, another day. But I'll die tomorrow, don't worry. He wouldn't touch food on any account. Buandulino stroked the old man's brow and brushed away the flies, and then, not knowing how to console his dying father but wishing to show him that his son wasn't the fool he had always thought, Buandulino told him about the holy quest he had been preparing for so long, and how he wanted to reach the kingdom of Prester John. If you only knew, he said, I will go and discover marvelous places. In one of them there is a bird like nothing anyone's ever seen, the phoenix. It lives and flies for 500 years. When 500 years have gone by, the priests prepare an altar, sprinkling spices and sulfur on it. Then the bird arrives and catches fire and turns to ashes. The next day among the ashes a worm appears, the second day a full-grown bird, and the third day this bird flies off. It is no bigger than an eagle, on its head it has a feathery crest like a peacock's, the neck is a golden color, the beak is indigo blue, and the wings purple, the tail striped with yellow, green, and red. So the phoenix never dies. That's all bullshit, Gagliardo said. For me, it would be enough just to bring Rosina back to life, poor animal. You killed her stuffing her with all that spoiled wheat. To hell with your Felix. When I come back, I'll bring you some manna. It's found on the mountains in the country of Job. It's white and very sweet. It comes from the dew that falls from heaven on the grass, where it clots. It cleanses the blood, drives away melancholy. Cleanse my balls. That's stuff good for your court scum, who eat snipe and pastry. Don't you want a piece of bread, at least? I don't have time. I have to die tomorrow morning. The next morning Buandulino told him how he would give the emperor the Grazel, the cup from which our Lord had drunk. Oh, yes? What's it like? It's all gold, studded with lapis lazuli. You see what a fool you are? Our Lord was a carpenter's son and he lived with people who were even hungrier than he was. All his life he wore the same clothes. The priest in church told us they didn't have seams so as not to wear out before he was 33, and you come here to tell me he was roistering with a cup made of gold and lapis lazuli. Fine tales you tell. He was lucky if he had a bowl like this, that his father had carved out of a root, the way I did, something that lasts a lifetime and you can't break it, not even with a hammer. And now that I think of it, give me some more of this blood of Jesus Christ. It's the only thing that helps me die well. By the devil, Buandulino said to himself, this old man is right. The Grazel should be a cup like this one. Simple, poor as the Lord himself was. And for this reason perhaps it is there, within everyone's grasp, and no one has ever recognized it because they have been searching all their lives for something gleaming. But it's not that Buandulino, at that moment, was giving so much thought to the Grazel. He didn't want to see his father die, but he realized that, in allowing him to die, he was doing the old man's will. After a few days, old Gagliardo was as wrinkled as a dried chestnut, and breathing with difficulty, now rejecting even wine. Father, Buandulino said to him, if you really want to die, make your peace with the Lord and you will enter paradise, which is like the palace of Prester John. The Lord God will be seated on a great throne at the top of a tower, and above the back of the throne there will be 2 golden apples, and in each of them 2 great carbuncles that shine all night long. The arms of the throne will be of emerald. The 7 steps to the throne will be of onyx, crystal, jasper, amethyst, sardonyx, cornelian, and chrysolite. Columns of fine gold will be all around. And above the throne, flying angels will sing sweet songs. And there will be some devils who will kick my behind out of there, because in a place like that a man stinking of cow shit is someone they don't want around them. Just shut up. Then, all of a sudden, he opened his eyes wide, tried to sit erect, as Buandulino held him. Dear Lord, now I'm dying, because I can really see paradise. Oh, how beautiful it is. What do you see, Father? Buandulino was now sobbing. It's just like our stable, only all cleaned up, and Rosina is there, too. And there's that sainted mother of yours, wicked bitch, now you'll tell me where you put the pitchfork for the muck. Gagliardo belched, dropped the bowl, and remained wide-eyed, staring at the celestial stable. Buandulino gently ran a hand over his face, because, by now what the old man had to see he saw even with his eyes closed, and then Buandulino went to tell the people in Alessandria what had happened. The citizens wanted the great old man to be honored with solemn funeral ceremonies, because he was the man who had saved the city, and they decided they would place his statue over the portal of the cathedral. Buandulino went back once more to his parents' house, to look for some memento, since he had decided never to return. On the ground he saw his father's bowl, and picked it up as a precious relic. He washed it carefully, so that it wouldn't stink of wine, because, he told himself, if one day it were said that this was the Grazel, after all the time that had gone by since the Last Supper, it should no longer smell of anything, if not perhaps of those aromas that, thinking this was the true cup, all would surely perceive. He wrapped the bowl in his cloak and carried it off. 23. Buandulino on the Third Crusade. When darkness fell over Constantinople they set off. It was a sizable party, but in those days various bands of citizenry moved like lost souls from one end of the city to another, to look for a porch where they could spend the night. Buandulino had taken off his crusader garb, because, if someone were to stop him and ask him the name of his lord, he would have difficulty replying. At their head went Pevera, Boimondo, Grillo, and Terabrillo, with the air of 4 men accidentally taking the same path. But they looked around at every corner, clutching their just sharpened knives under their clothing. Shortly before they reached St. Sophia, a ruffian with blue eyes and long yellow mustache rushed towards the group, grabbed the hand of one of the girls, no matter how ugly and pocked she appeared, and tried to drag her off. Buandulino told himself the moment had come to give battle, and the Genoese were with him, but Nikitas had a better idea. He saw a group of horsemen coming down the street and he flung himself on his knees before them, asking justice and mercy, appealing to their honor. They were probably the Doge's men, and they set to striking the barbarian with the flat of their swords, driving him off and restoring the girl to her family. Beyond the hippodrome the Genoese chose safer streets, narrow alleys, where the houses were all burned or bore obvious signs of scrupulous looting. The pilgrims, if they were still looking for something to steal, had gone elsewhere. Towards night they passed the walls of Theodosius. There the rest of the Genoese were waiting with the mules. They bade farewell to their protectors, with many embraces and good wishes, and went off along the country road, under a springtime sun, with the moon almost full on the horizon. A light wind was blowing off the sea. They had all rested during the day, and the journey did not seem to tire even the wife of Nikitas. But he was extremely tired, gasping at every jolt of his steed, and every half hour he had to ask the others to let him rest for a while. You ate too much, Master Nikitas, Buandulino said to him. Would you deny and exile the final delicacies of his homeland as it is dying? Nikitas replied. Then he looked for a boulder or a fallen tree trunk on which to sit, but it's my eagerness to learn the rest of your adventure. Sit here, Buandulino, feel this peace, smell the good odors of the countryside. Let us rest a little and go on with your story. As later, in the 3 days following, they traveled by day and rested at night beneath the open sky, to avoid places inhabited by God knows whom. It was under the stars, in a silence broken only by the rustle of boughs and by sudden sounds of nocturnal animals, that Buandulino continued his account. At that time, and we're in the year 1187, Saladin unleashed the last attack on Christian Jerusalem. He won. He behaved generously, allowing all those who could pay a tax to leave the city, unharmed, and he confined himself to beheading before the walls all the Knights Templar because, as all admitted, he was generous, yes, but no general worthy of the name could have spared the chosen troop of the invader enemy, and even the Templars knew that, in following their trade, they were accepting the rule that no prisoners were taken. But for all Saladin's demonstrated magnanimity, the whole Christian world was shaken by the end of that Frankish rule overseas that had resisted for almost 100 years. The Pope appealed to all the monarchs of Europe for a third expedition of crusaders again to liberate Jerusalem, now reconquered by the infidel. For Buandulino, his emperor's participation in that enterprise was the occasion he had been awaiting. To descend on Palestine meant preparing to move to the east with an invincible army. Jerusalem would be retaken in a flash, and afterwards nothing would remain but to continue towards the Indias. However, it was on this occasion that he discovered how weary and uncertain Frederick felt. He had pacified Italy, but surely he feared that, leaving it, he would lose the advantages he had gained. Or perhaps he was troubled by the idea of a new expedition towards Palestine, remembering his crime during the previous expedition, when, driven by rage, he had destroyed that Bulgarian monastery. Who knows? He hesitated. He asked himself if it was his duty, and when you start asking this question, Buandulino said to himself, it's already a sign that there is no duty that is drawing you on. I was 45 years old, Master Nikitas, and I was risking the dream of my life, or my life itself, since my life had been built around that dream. And so, coldly, I decided to give my adoptive father a hope, a sign from heaven of his mission. After the fall of Jerusalem, the survivors of that ruin arrived in our Christian lands, and through the imperial court had passed 7 knights of the temple who, God knows how, had escaped the vengeance of Saladin. They were in bad shape, but perhaps you don't know what the Templars are like, drinkers and fornicators, and they'll sell you their sister if you give them yours to grope. Or, better still, it is said, your little brother. In short, let's say I gave them refreshment, and everyone saw me going around the taverns with them. Hence it wasn't hard for me one day to tell Frederick those shameless simoniacs had stolen in Jerusalem the Grazel itself. I said that, since the Templars were broke, I gave them all the money I had, and I bought it. Frederick naturally was dumbfounded at first. But wasn't the Grazel in the hands of Prester John, who wanted to give it to him? And weren't we planning to go look for John precisely to receive that most holy relic as a gift? So it was, my father, I said to him, but obviously some treacherous minister robbed it from John, and sold it to some band of Templars, who had come raiding those parts, not realizing where they were. It wasn't important to know the how and the when. We were now proposing to the Holy and Roman Emperor another and more extraordinary opportunity. He could seek out Prester John with the aim of returning the Grazel to him. Not using that incomparable relic to gain power, but to fulfill a duty, which would win him the gratitude of the priest and eternal fame throughout all Christendom. Between seizing the Grazel and returning it, between hoarding it and returning it to where it had been stolen, between possessing it, as all dreamed, and performing the supreme sacrifice of depriving himself of it, it was obvious on which side the true blessing lay, the glory of being the one and true Rex et Sacerdos. Frederick would become the new Joseph of Arimathea. You were lying to your father. I was acting for his good, and the good of the empire. You didn't ask yourself what would happen if Frederick really reached the priest, handed him the Grazel, and the priest widened his eyes, wondering what this bowl was that he had never seen before. Frederick would have become not the glory but the laughingstock of Christendom. Master Nikitas, you know men better than I imagine. Your Prester John, a great emperor of the West, kneels at your feet, and hands you such a relic, saying it is rightfully yours, and you start snickering and saying you've never seen that tavern bowl before? Come now, I'm not saying the priest would have pretended to recognize it. I'm saying that, dazzled by the glory that would fall on him, its acknowledged custodian, he would have recognized it at once, believing he had always possessed it. And so I took to Frederick, as a most precious object, the bowl of my father Gagliardo, and I swear to you that at that moment I felt like the celebrant of a sacred rite. I handed over the gift and the memory of my carnal father to my spiritual father, and my carnal father was right. That most humble thing, with which he had communicated all his life as a sinner, was truly, spiritually the cup used by poor Christ, who was heading for death, for the redemption of all sinners. In saying the Mass, doesn't the priest take the most common bread and the most common wine and make them become the body and blood of our Lord? But you weren't a priest. And, in fact, I didn't say that the object was the blood of Christ, I said only that it had contained that blood. I wasn't usurping any sacramental power. I was bearing witness. False witness. No, you told me that, believing a relic true, you catch it sent. We believe that we, only we, need God, but often God needs us. At that moment I believed it was necessary to help him. That cup must truly have existed if our Lord had used it. If it had been lost, it had been through the fault of some worthless man. I was restoring the Grazel to Christianity. God would not have contradicted me. The proof is that even my companions believed in it immediately. The sacred vessel was there, before their eyes, now in the hands of Frederick, who raised it to heaven as if he were in ecstasy, and Boron knelt, seeing for the first time the object over which he had long raved. Kayat said at once that he seemed to see a great light. Rabbi Solomon admitted that, even if Christ were not the true Messiah awaited by his people, surely this receptacle emanated a fragrance, as of incense. Zosimos widened his visionary eyes and blessed himself backwards several times, as you schismatics do. Abdul was trembling in every limb and murmured that possessing the sacred relic was equivalent to having conquered all the kingdoms beyond the sea, and it was clear that he would have liked to donate it as a too. The sacred vessel was there, before their eyes, now in the hands of Frederick, who raised it to heaven as if he were in ecstasy, and Boron knelt, seeing for the first time the object over which he had long raved. Kayat said at once that he seemed to see a great light. Rabbi Solomon admitted that, even if Christ were not the true Messiah awaited by his people, surely this receptacle emanated a fragrance, as of incense. Zosimos widened his visionary eyes and blessed himself backwards several times, as you schismatics do. Abdul was trembling in every limb and murmured that possessing the sacred relic was equivalent to having conquered all the kingdoms beyond the sea, and it was clear that he would have liked to donate it as a token of love to his faraway princess. Had long raved, Kayat said at once that he seemed to see a great light. Rabbi Solomon admitted that, even if Christ were not the true Messiah awaited by his people, surely this receptacle emanated a fragrance, as of incense. Zosimos widened his visionary eyes and blessed himself backwards several times, as you schismatics do. Abdul was trembling in every limb and murmured that possessing the sacred relic was equivalent to having conquered all the kingdoms beyond the sea, and it was clear that he would have liked to donate it as a token of love to his faraway princess. I had tears in my eyes, and was asking myself why heaven had chosen me as mediator of that portentous event. As for the poet, frowning, he chewed his nails. I knew what he was thinking. That I had been a fool, that Frederick was old and would never be able to derive advantage from that treasure, and we might as well have kept it for ourselves, and if we had set off towards the lands of the north, they would have bestowed a kingdom on us. Confronted by the obvious weakness of the emperor, he was returning to his fantasies of power. But I was almost consoled because I understood that, reacting like this, he also considered the Grazel a genuine object. Frederick devoutly enclosed the cup in a coffer, hanging the key around his neck, and Buandulino thought that he himself had acted well, because at that instant he had the impression that not only the poet but all his other friends would have been ready to steal that object, to rush towards their own personal dreams. Afterwards, the emperor affirmed that now, truly, it was necessary to set out. An expedition of conquest had to be prepared carefully. In the following year Frederick sent ambassadors to Saladin, and sought encounters with envoys of Stephen Nemanja, Prince of the Serbs, to arrange passage through their territories. While the kings of England and France were deciding to leave by sea, in May of 1189, Frederick had gone overland from Ratisbon with 15,000 horsemen and 15,000 squires. Some were saying that in the plains of Hungary he passed in review 60,000 horsemen and 100,000 foot soldiers. Others were even to speak of 600,000 pilgrims. Perhaps all were exaggerating. Even Buandulino was in no position to say how many they really were. Perhaps in all they came to 20,000 men, but in any case it was a great army. Without anyone's going out and counting them one by one, from a distance they were a tended horde whose beginning you could see but not their end. To avoid the massacres and lootings of the previous expeditions, the emperor would not have them followed by those swarms of outcasts who, 100 years earlier, had shed so much blood in Jerusalem. This was something to be done properly, by men who knew how war is waged, not by wretches who set off with the excuse of winning paradise and came home with the spoils of some Jew whose throat they had cut along the way. Frederick accepted only those who could support themselves for 2 years, and the poor soldiers received 3 silver marks for food during the journey. If you want to liberate Jerusalem, you have to spend what it takes. Many Italians had joined the venture. There were the Cremonese with Bishop Siccardo, the men of Brescia, of Verona with Cardinal Adelardo, and even some Alessandrians, including old friends of Buandulino like Boidi, Cutica of Quarnento, Porcelli, Alaramo Scacciabarozzi known as Bonehead, Calandrino the brother of Calandrina, who was therefore a brother-in-law, and also one of the Trotti men, Pazzi, Gallini, Lanzavecchia, Peri, and Viziati, Gamberini, and Cermelli, all at their own expense or supported by their city. Theirs was a sumptuous departure along the Danube to Vienna. At Breslava, in June, they met the King of Hungary. Then they entered the Bulgarian forest. In July they met the Prince of the Serbs, who sought an alliance against Byzantium. I believe that this meeting, Buandulino said, worried your Basileus Isaac. He feared that the army wanted to conquer Constantinople. He wasn't mistaken. He was mistaken by 15 years. At that time, Frederick really did want to reach Jerusalem. But we were uneasy. I understand. An immense foreign army was about to cross your territory, and you were concerned. But you certainly made our life difficult. We arrived at Serdica and we didn't find the promised supplies. Around Philippopolis we were confronted by your troops, and then they retreated in full flight, as happened in every conflict during those months. You know that, at that time, I was governor of Philippopolis. We received conflicting news from the court. At one point the Basileus ordered us to construct a girdle of walls and to dig a moat, to oppose your arrival. Then immediately after we had done that, an order came that we were to destroy everything, so the city wouldn't serve as a haven for your people. You blocked the mountain passes, having trees chopped down. You attacked our men singly if they went off to look for food. You were sacking our lands. Because you weren't providing the promised rations. Your people lowered food from the walls in baskets, but they mixed lime and other poisonous substances in the bread. During that journey the emperor received a letter from Sibyl, former queen of Jerusalem, who informed him that Saladin, to halt the advance of the Christians, had sent to the emperor of Byzantium bushels of poisoned grain, and a pot of wine so heavily poisoned that a slave of Isaac's, forced to sniff it, died on the spot. Fairy tales. When Frederick sent ambassadors to Constantinople, your Basileus made them remain standing, then imprisoned them. Afterwards they were sent back to Frederick. When we entered Philippopolis, we found it empty, because all had slipped away. You weren't there either. It was my duty to evade capture. That may be, but it was after our entry into Philippopolis that your emperor changed his tone. That is where we encountered the Armenian community. The Armenians considered you brothers. They are schismatics like you. They don't venerate the holy images, they use unleavened bread. They're good Christians. Some of them spoke at once in the name of their prince, Leo, guaranteeing passage and assistance through their country. But things weren't that simple, as we learned at Adrianopolis, when ambassadors arrived from the Seleucian Sultan of Iconium, Kilij Arslan, who proclaimed himself lord of the Turks and the Syrians, and also of the Armenians. Who was in command, and where? Kilij was trying to halt the supremacy of Saladin, and wanted to conquer the Christian kingdom of Armenia, so he was hoping that Frederick could help him. The Armenians were confident that Frederick could contain Kilijeh's demands. Our Isaac, still smarting from the defeat suffered at the hands of the Seljuks at Myriokephalon, hoped that Frederick would clash with Kilij, but he wouldn't have been displeased if there had also been conflict with the Armenians, who were causing our empire no little trouble. That's why, when he learned that both the Seljuks and the Armenians were guaranteeing Frederick passage through their lands, he realized he should not halt that march but encourage it, allowing him to cross the Propontis. He was sending him against our enemies and away from us. My poor father, I don't know if he suspected he was a weapon in the hands of a tangle of interwoven enemies. Or perhaps he did understand, but hoped he could defeat them all. What I do know is that, glimpsing the possibility of an alliance with a Christian kingdom, the Armenian, beyond Byzantium, Frederick was eagerly thinking of his final goal. He dreamed, and I, with him, that the Armenians would be able to open the road for him towards the kingdom of Prester John. In any case, it's as you said, after the envoys from the Seljuks and the Armenians, your Isaac gave us the ships. And it was, in fact, at Gallipolis, which you people call Callipolis, that I saw you, when in the name of your basileus, you offered us the vessels. It was not an easy decision on our part, Nikitas said. The basileus risked turning Saladin against him. He had to send messengers to him to explain the reasons for our concessions. A great lord, Saladin, he understood at once, and bore us no ill will. I repeat, from the Turks we have nothing to fear. Our problem is with your schismatics, always. Nikitas and Buandulino agreed that there was no point in exchanging recriminations or explanations of that bygone episode. Perhaps Isaac was right. Every Christian pilgrim who passed through Byzantium was always tempted to stop there, where there were so many beautiful things to conquer, without going and risking too much before the walls of Jerusalem. But Frederick truly wanted to go on. They arrived at Gallipolis and, while it wasn't Constantinople, the army was seduced by that festive place, the port full of galleys and dromons, ready to take on board horses, horsemen, and victuals. It was not the work of a day, and meanwhile our friends had time on their hands. From the beginning of the journey Buandulino had decided to employ Zosimos for something useful, and forced him to teach Greek to the group. In the place where we are going, he said, nobody knows Latin, to say nothing of German, Provençal, or my language. With Greek, there's always some hope of making yourself understood. And so, between visits to the bordello and the reading of some texts of the Fathers of the Eastern Church, the waiting was not burdensome. In the port there was a vast market, and they decided to venture into it, conquered by the distant gleaming and the odor of spices. Zosimos, whom they had freed so that he could be their guide, but under the vigilant surveillance of Boron, who didn't take his eyes off him for a second, now warned them. You Latin and Alaman barbarians are ignorant of the civilization of us Romans. You should know that in our markets, at first glance, you wouldn't want to buy anything because they ask too much, and if you immediately pay what they ask, it's not that they take you for fools, because they already know you are fools, but they are offended because the merchant's joy is bargaining. So offer 2 coins when they ask 10, they'll come down to 7, you offer 3 and they come down to 5, you stick to 3, until they give in, weeping and swearing they'll end up homeless with all their family. At that point, go ahead and buy, but you should know that the object was worth 1 coin. Then why should we buy? The poet asked. Because they also have a right to live, and 3 coins for what is worth 1 represents an honest trade. But I must give you another warning. Not only do merchants have a right to live, but so do thieves, and since they can't rob one another, they'll try to rob you. If you prevent them, that's your right, but if they succeed, you mustn't complain. So I advise you to carry little money in your purse, just the amount you've decided to spend, and no more. Instructed by a guide so wise in local ways, our friends ventured into a tide of people stinking of garlic, like all Greeklings. Buandulino bought himself 2 Arab daggers, well made, to keep at either side of his belt, to be extracted rapidly, as he crossed his arms. Abdul found a little transparent box that contained a lock of hair, God knows whose, but it was clear whom he had in mind. Solomon called the others in a loud voice when he discovered the tent of a Persian selling miraculous potions. The vendor of elixirs displayed a phial that, according to him, contained a very potent drug that, taken in small doses, stimulated the vital spirits, but if drained quickly could cause death. Then he held up a similar phial, which, however, contained the most powerful of antidotes, capable of cancelling the action of any poison. Solomon, who dabbled also in the art of medicine, like all Jews, bought the antidote. Belonging to a race more clever than the Rami, he managed to pay 1 coin instead of the 10 asked, and he was tormented by the fear of having paid at least double the value. Leaving the apothecary's tent, Kayat found an elegant scarf, and Boron, after considering all the merchandise at length, shook his head, murmuring that, for one in the service of an emperor who possessed the Grazel, all the treasures of the world were filth, and these things worst of all. They came upon Boidi, the Alessandrian, who by now had become one of their group. He was enchanted by a ring, perhaps of gold. The vendor wept at selling it because it had belonged to his mother, which contained in its mound a wondrous cordial, a single sip of which could heal a wounded man and, in certain cases, resuscitate a dead one. He bought it, he said, because if they really had to risk their necks before the walls of Jerusalem, it was best to take some precaution. Zosimos was ecstatically contemplating a seal bearing the initial Z, his own, which was being sold with a little stick of sealing wax. The Z was so worn that perhaps it would leave no mark on the wax, but this fact testified to the distinct antiquity of the object. Naturally, as a prisoner, he had no money, but Solomon, touched, bought the seal for him. At a certain point, driven by the crowd, they realized they had lost the poet, but they found him again as he was pulling down the price of a sword that, according to the merchant, dated back to the conquest of Jerusalem. But when he reached for his purse, he realized that Zosimos was right. With his pale blue pensive almond eyes, he attracted thieves like flies. Buandulino was moved and made him a present of the sword. The next day a richly dressed man turned up at the encampment, with exaggerated obsequious manners, accompanied by 2 servants. He asked to see Zosimos. The monk conferred with him for a while, then came to tell Buandulino that this was Mkhitar Ardzruni, a noble Armenian dignitary, who had been charged with a secret mission by Prince Leo. Ardzruni? Nikitas said, I know about him. He came several times to Constantinople in the days of Andronicus and afterwards. I understand why he sought out Zosimos, because he had the reputation of an amateur of magical sciences. One of my friends in Selymbria, but God knows if we will find him still there, was also a guest in his castle at Dojig. So were we, as I will tell you, and for our misfortune. The fact that he was Zosimos' friend was for me a very unfortunate sign, but I informed Frederick, who wanted to see him. This Ardzruni was very reticent about his credentials. He had been sent, or not sent, by Leo, or he had been sent but he wasn't to say so. He was there to guide the imperial army through the territory of the Turks into Armenia. Ardzruni expressed himself with the emperor in acceptable Latin, but when he wanted to remain vague he pretended he was unable to find the right word. Frederick said he was treacherous, like all Armenians, but a man familiar with the locality was convenient and he decided to add him to the army, asking me merely to keep an eye on him. I must say that during the journey, he behaved impeccably, always giving information that proved correct. 24. Buandulino in the castle of Ardzruni. In March 1190 the army entered Asia and reached Laodicea, then headed for the territories of the Seljuk Turks. The old Sultan of Iconium called himself an ally of Frederick, but his sons deposed him and attacked the Christian army. Or perhaps Kilij had also changed his mind, we never really found out. Clashes, skirmishes, outright battles. Frederick advanced as victor, but his army had been decimated by the cold, by hunger, and by the attacks of the Turkomans, who arrived suddenly, struck the flanks of his army and fled, knowing well the passes and the hiding places. Struggling through sun-baked desert territories, the soldiers had been forced to drink their own urine or the blood of the horses. When they arrived at Iconium, the pilgrims' army was reduced to no more than 1,000 horsemen. And yet it was a fine siege, and young Frederick of Swabia, sickly though he was, fought well, taking the city himself. You speak coldly of young Frederick. He didn't love me. He mistrusted everyone. He was jealous of his younger brother, who was stealing the imperial crown from him, and surely he was jealous of me, who was not of his blood, jealous of his father's affection for me. Perhaps as a child he had been troubled by the way I looked at his mother, or she looked at me. He was jealous of the authority I had gained by giving the Grazel to his father, and on this matter he always displayed some skepticism. When there was talk of an expedition to the Indias, I heard him murmur that it could be discussed at the proper time. He felt dethroned by all. That's why at Iconium he behaved with valor, even though he had a fever that day. Only when his father praised him for that fine achievement, and in front of all his barons, did I see a light of joy gleam in his eyes. The one time in his life, I believe. I went to pay him homage, and I was truly happy for him, but he thanked me absently. Like me, Buandulino, I too wrote and am writing the chronicles of my empire, emphasizing more the petty jealousies, the hatred, the envy that jeopardized both powerful families in great public undertakings. Even emperors are human beings, and history is also the story of their weaknesses. But do go on. Once Iconium was conquered, Frederick immediately sent ambassadors to Leo of Armenia, asking his help in proceeding across his territories. A pact existed, they had been the ones to promise this. And yet Leo hadn't yet sent anyone to receive us. Perhaps he was seized by the fear of meeting the same end as the Sultan of Iconium. So we went ahead, not knowing if we would receive aid, and Ardzruni guided us, saying that surely the ambassadors of his prince would arrive. One June day, turning southwards, having passed Laranda, we ventured into the Taurus Mountains, and finally we saw some cemeteries with crosses. We were in Cilicia, in Christian country. We were immediately received by the Armenian lord of Sibelia, and, farther on, near a cursed river whose name I have chosen to forget, we encountered a deputation that arrived in Leo's name. The moment it was sighted, Ardzruni warned us that it was best for him to keep out of sight, and he vanished. We met 2 dignitaries, Constant and Badouin de Camardis, and I have never seen ambassadors of more uncertain intentions. One announced as imminent the arrival in great pomp of Leo and Gregory the Catholicos, the other hemmed and hawed, pointing out that, while most eager to help the emperor, the Armenian prince couldn't show Saladin that he was opening the way to his enemies, and therefore he had to act with great prudence. When the delegation had left, Ardzruni reappeared and took Zosimos aside, who then went to Buandulino and, with him, to Frederick. Ardzruni says that, far be it from him to have any wish to betray his lord, but he suspects that for Leo it would be a stroke of luck if he went no farther. In what sense? Frederick asked. Does he want to offer me wine and maidens so I'll forget I must go on to Jerusalem? Wine perhaps. Poisoned wine. He says you should remember the letter of Queen Sybil, Zosimos said. How does he know about that letter? Rumors spread. If Leo were to arrest your march, he would do something very pleasing to Saladin, and Saladin could help him achieve his dream of becoming Sultan of Iconium, since Kilij and his sons have been shamefully defeated. And why is Ardzruni so concerned about my life, even to the point of betraying his master? Only our Lord gave his life for love of humanity. The seed of men, born in sin, is like the seed of animals. Even the cow gives you milk only if you give her hay. What does this holy maxim teach us? That Ardzruni would not object one day to taking the place of Leo. Ardzruni is respected by many of the Armenians, Leo isn't. And so, winning the gratitude of the Holy and Roman Emperor, he could one day rely on the most powerful of friends. So for this reason he suggests proceeding to his castle at Dojig, on the banks of this same river, to encamp your men in the vicinity. While waiting till we can understand what Leo is really guaranteeing, you could stay with him, safe from any trap. And he urges you, above all, to be careful, especially about the food and the drink that any compatriot of his might offer you. By the devil, Frederick shouted. For a year I've been going from one nest of vipers to another. My fine German princes were lambs by comparison and, you know something? Even those treacherous Milanese who caused me so much suffering, at least they faced me in the open field, without trying to stab me in my sleep. What shall we do? His son Frederick suggested a